For Shoftim, and as I indicated, the first two prakim are an introduction to the entire book, but I'll warn you that the first two prakim are very obscure and very difficult, actually. Then it gets a little easier to understand what is going on. It starts off saying, so I'm going to do a little reading today. After the death of Yehoshua, so it says, Vayishalu b'nei Yisrael b'Hashem. B'nei Yisrael inquired of God, Lamor, and this is what they asked, a question, Mi yaleh lanu el haknani bat chila lehilachem bo. Who should be the first among us to go wage war against the Canaanites? A question, and Pasuk Beis gives us the answer. Vayomer Hashem, Hashem said, Yehuda Yala, Yehuda should be the first one. Hine nosati es haaretz biyado, and behold, I will deliver the land unto his hands. So we have a question and an answer. The question is directed by Bnei Yisrael to Hashem. So how do you ask Hashem a question, right? We daven, etc., but we normally don't hear an answer. What does it mean to ask Hashem a question? So all the Meforshim say this is always a reference in Tanakh to the Urim V'tumim. The Kohen Gadol had one of his big day kahuna was the Choshen. The Choshen is the breastplate, and the breastplate had 12 jewels. And on those 12 jewels were engraved the names of the 12 Shvatim. And now here again, I want to correct, I may have said this, I'm not sure, but so forgive me if I'm repeating, it's hard for me to remember. But a lot of people confuse the Urim V'tumim with the Choshen. I mean, you ask people, what is the Urim V'tumim? People say the Urim V'tumim is the breastplate with the jewels. That is not emes. The breastplate is called the Choshen, and the jewels are called the Avnei Miluim, the stones that fill. One way to look at it is that the Choshen is the hardware, the Urim V'tumim is the software. The Urim V'tumim is a piece of parchment. And on that piece of parchment there were certain names of Hashem that were written. And when the parchment was inserted in the folds of the breastplate, which folded up, that empowered, so to speak, the breastplate to serve as a prophetic medium to convey messages from Hashem. It was a form of prophecy. So, for example, the Mishnah says that there was no Urim V'tumim in the second Beis HaMikdash. That doesn't mean the Kohen Gadol didn't have the Choshen. The Kohen Gadol had the Choshen. That was, first of all, if he didn't have it, they could make it. I mean, this is one of the required Big Day Kahuna. There's no such thing as they didn't have the Big Day Kahuna. Just because they didn't have the original ones from Moshe, they would make a new one. See, Bishlama, when we say, be sure you understand this. When we say they didn't have an Arain in the second Beis HaMikdash, because it was concealed, you can't ask a kasha, why didn't they make a new Aron? Because the answer is very pashut. There is no purpose in having an Aron unless you have the luchos in the Aron. If the first Aron is gone, that means the luchos are gone. If the luchos are gone, there's no point in making a new Aron. So in the second Beis HaMikdash, there was no Aron HaKodesh. When the Kohen Gadol walked into the Kodesh HaKodashim, it was an empty room. But that's only true for the Aron, and because of the luchos, which are irreplaceable. But anything else, if we lost the menorah, we lost the shulchan, we lost the Big Day Kahuna, there's no such thing as that being lost. All that happens is you make a new one. So the statement that they didn't have the Urim V'tumim in the Bayis Sheni is not a reference to the Choshen and the Avnei HaChoshen. It is only a reference to the prophetic power. Now, whether that means they lost the parchment, or whether it means they had the parchment but it wasn't working, it could be either one of those. But it makes perfect sense that they didn't have the Urim V'tumim in the Bayis Sheni, because the Urim V'tumim is a form of Nevuah, and we didn't have prophecy in the Bayis Sheni, so we didn't have the Urim V'tumim either. Right? That's all. In other words, the Urim V'tumim is an example of prophecy that was lost. So when the Urim V'tumim worked, right, Urim is a lashon of light, and Tumim is a lashon of complete, Tamima. So the Kohen Gadol, on behalf of the Jewish people, would ask questions, and letters would light up that would spell out the answers. Now, obviously, you don't use the Urim V'tumim for essay questions. You use them for single-word answers. Yes, no, shall we go to war, shall we not go to war? Which tribe, right? So in the case of Yehuda, this is an easy one. The letters that lit up were simply, which tribe should go to war first? So this is easy. The stone of Yehuda, the letters light up. Other times it's a little more complicated when you're asking a question that requires different letters to light up, to spell out a word. And as the Gra points out in a very famous word, the Kohen Gadol required a level of Ruach HaKodesh to unscramble the letters. Because if a given word comprised certain letters, but the letters were in different tribal names, and they were not in the order of the answer, it required Ruach HaKodesh. Right? The famous word from the Gra, you may have heard, if you remember the Gemara in Brachos, the Perek of Brachos, we learn out all the laws of Shemona Esrei from the prayers of Chana. And Chana's lips are moving, and her voice is not heard. So the pasuk says, "V'yachshiveha Eli, Eli," the next to the last shofet, beginning of Sefer Shmuel. Eli thought she was drunk. She's opening her mouth, and no sound is coming out, intoxicated. And she answered, "Lo Adoni," no, my master. But Chazal Darshan, you are not my master, meaning your Ruach HaKodesh failed you. That's what the Gemara says. So the Vilna Gaon explains very, very beautifully that Eli asked the Urim V'tumim, what is the condition of this woman? And it spelled out Chaf, Shin, Reish, Hey. Those 4 letters from the different tribes. Eli read it as if it said Shikora, drunk. But the real, right, Shin, Chaf, Reish, Hey. But the real arrangement was Kaf, Shin, Reish, Hey, Kesheira. Right, so this is an example where the message needed to be deciphered through Ruach HaKodesh. Not in this case. In this case, it was simple because the answer was a tribe, so obviously you had all the letters in the tribe. But other times it took a level of Ruach HaKodesh. Now, there is a machlokas rishonim. If, when the letters lit up, it was visible to everybody saw the letters light up, or no, this was Gufa, only the Kohen Gadol saw the letters, and essentially he was conveying the message through a prophetic vision that he had. That's a machlokas rishonim. Yeah.
What about the second part of the phrase where it says, "I have given to you in the past tense. I've given to you to whose hand the land already." That part was also communicated by the Urim V'tumim?
Yeah, yes. I mean, actually, it's the whole sentence. Yehuda Ya'aleh Hinei Nosati Eretz Biyado. So again, the question would be, how was that conveyed? That's not entirely clear. It may be that Yehuda was the answer of the Urim V'tumim, and then there was a supplementary prophecy about the other things.
Who would that have gone to?
No, it could go to the Kohen Gadol as well. Meaning, once he gets his answer, there's going to be a prophecy, and the like. By the way. Again, I hope you have to remind me. Did I tell you a word from the Chassam Sofer about the stone of Binyamin and the Choshen? Did I? Anyone remember? Okay, if you don't remember it, even if I did say it, then I could say it again because you don't remember it. Okay. But if I didn't say it, I'm glad I didn't say it. Let me tell you a word from the Chassam Sofer. Do you remember the famous Maisa in Maseches Kedushin about Dama ben Netinah. Dama ben Netinah was a guy. He was not a Jewish person who lived in Ashkelon. And the Gemara uses Dama ben Netinah as the exemplar of Kibbutz Aviyim. And it mentions that one time, and this is during the Bayesheni, this is actually my raya, that they did have the stones of the Choshen in the Bayesheni. One time, one of the stones in the Choshen popped out, got lost. And they had to find a replacement for that precious jewel. And the only guy that had it was Dama ben Netinah. And the problem was, when they went to him in Ashkelon, the key to the jewel box was under his father's pillow, and his father was sleeping. So he refused to wake up his father to retrieve the jewel, and he lost out on that sale. Ad Kedei Kach, and it was a very precious jewel. He would have gotten a lot of money, but this is how careful he was in the mitzvah of Kibbutz Aviyim. He was willing to give up a tremendous amount of money. As a reward, HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave him a para aduma in his flock, which was very needed. And they wanted to offer him, they came back to him and they offered him a lot of money for the para aduma, and he even more than the jewel. And he said, no, just give me what I would have made on the jewel. And that would have been good, right? That's the story of Dama ben Netinah. Now, one interesting HaRav about Dama ben Netinah is, well, wait a second. The Gemara is citing this story as an example of proper Kibbutz Aviyim. Is this story halachic? I mean, imagine this. Imagine somebody offers you, let's say, $5 million for the jewel, and you don't want to wake up your father. So dad wakes up an hour later and says, Abba, I want to tell you how much, I respect you, how much I honor you. We were offered $5 million and I turned it down because I didn't want to wake you up. What do you think of your son? Well, dad's going to say, I think my son is a glaring idiot, ought to go to a mental hospital. What? In other words, halacha, it's very obvious, actually, that if you know for sure. In fact, even on things less, your father says, wake me up to go to Minyan. Wake me up if a phone call comes in. Wake me up if somebody's offering us money for something. You don't make a cheshbon. I honor my father, I don't wake him up. The kavod is to do what your father would want. So it's a davar pashut. L'chaira, that Dama ben Netinah should have woken up his father. Why is the Gemara mishabeach him for turning down a huge deal? So there are a few possibilities. Possibility number one is, it was not a halachic response. Meaning, what Dama ben Netinah did is not what you're supposed to do. He made a mistake. But he made a mistake out of the kavod he had for his father. So Chazal are not using him as an example of what you should actually do. They're using him as an example of how willing you should be to honor your father. In other words, sometimes the Gemara is using a mashal not because it's a halacha that you engage in, but because it shows a midah. It shows a midah tova that you should have. But actually, if you actually had the case, if you were in Dama ben Netinah's shoes, you should wake up your father, if you know that's what he would want. The other possibility, which is an interesting chiddush, this is a very interesting chiddush, is that maybe his father had dementia, meaning the following. If somebody has reached a certain level of senility, then he might say, I'd rather sleep than $5 million. Doesn't mean anything to me. It's interesting. If he's sane and normal and competent, for sure you wake him up because that's what he would want. Paradoxically, if he's mentally disabled, maybe that's not what he wants. And then you have to give up the fortune not to do something that's going to hurt him. So it's very interesting. So there may be more of a chiyuv towards a disabled parent than towards a parent that's able. A parent that's normal and competent, that does not have a mental disability, for sure would want to be woken up, b'derech klal. But if a person has dementia or senility, might not want to be woken up. So that would be the cheshbon. Okay, be it as it may, this is a raya. Dama ben Netinah was vaday during the second Beis HaMikdash. So we see clear that even though they didn't have Urim V'tumim, they did have the cheshbon. Now, Here's the thing. The Bavli in Kedushin does not tell us which stone fell out. And, it probably wouldn't make a big difference. But the Talmud Yerushalmi is Maisef, a prat, in the story that's very interesting. It was the last stone in the Choshen, the stone of Binyamin. Shevet Binyamin fell out, and the stone is the jewel, right? The Torah says what each jewel is. The jewel was a jewel called Yoshva. Yoshva from Shevet Binyamin fell out, and we don't know exactly what Yoshva is in translation, but Yoshva was a multicolored stone. It was kind of clear like a diamond, but it had multiple bands of color in it. Now, again, just to give you a sense of the 12 jewels, on the first jewel had a lot of engraving. Avram, Yitzchak, Yaakov, and then Ruvain. The next is Shimon, Levi, Yehuda, Yisachar, Zevulun, etc. Yosef, because since Levi is there, it doesn't have Ephraim and Menashe, it just says Yosef. The last stone is Binyamin, and under Binyamin are the words Shiftei Yeshurun, the upright tribes. Okay, so above Ruvain on the first stone is Avram, Yitzchak, Yaakov. Below Binyamin on the last stone is Shiftei Yeshurun. So the stone that popped out, according to the Yerushalmi, is the stone of Yoshva, which has the word Binyamin on it, as well as the word Shiftei Yeshurun. Now, if the Yerushalmi goes to the trouble to give me the exact detail about the stone that popped out, what would the significance be? Yeah, you say?
So I just had a question. Dama then, what was his ethnicity? Like which one of the...
Well, the Gemara doesn't say. It just says he was not Jewish. It could have been anybody. I don't know if we know Beferish what nation he was from. Not from Canaan. He could be a Yishmaeli. He could be an Arab. He could be an Edomite. He could be of the Kusim. So there are different Samaritans. There are different groups that he could have been, but he was not from the Canaanim. So this is one question. So what is the significance of the Yoshva stone from Binyamin? A second question that one would ask is that when the Rambam describes the tzura of the Avonim, the Rambam says the first stone did have Avram, Yitzchak, Yaakov, Ruvain. The last stone had Binyamin, but instead of Shiftei Yeshurun, the Rambam says it says Shiftei Ka, the tribes of God. So why does the Rambam deviate from the Gemara? The Gemara in Yuma says Shiftei Yeshurun, and the Rambam is Meshana it to Shiftei Ka. So there are two questions. Question number one is, what is the significance of Yoshva from Shevet Binyamin? And question number two is, why does the Rambam say Shiftei Ka when the Gemara in Yuma says Shiftei Yeshurun? So the Chasam Sofer says a Gevalig Teretz, although it's a little bit derech drush, but this is what the Chasam Sofer says. He says, we know that all of the Shvatim except Binyamin were tainted with some negative aspect of machlokas and animosity. Obviously, all the brothers who sold Yosef were tainted with jealousy and hatred. And Yosef himself was involved in machlokas. Yosef brought Lashon Hara about his brothers to his father, etc. So all of the Shvatim are tainted with certain aspects of sinna, kina, machlokas. Even Yosef, to some degree, bears some sign of machlokas. The only brother who represents a purity of achdus without any type of machlokas is Binyamin. Binyamin was not involved in mechiras Yosef bichlal. Binyamin represents what you might call the power of pure love. Although we're going to see in the book of Shoftim B'dafka that Binyamin had some very bad behavior with the concubine of Giva. We'll get to that. But at least from until this point, Binyamin as a Shevet represents the power of love. Now, the appellation that Klal Yisrael are called Shiftei Yeshurin, the tribes of the upright ones. Where do you get the name Yeshurin? Where do we find that Klal Yisrael is called Yeshurun? We find it in a pasuk in Zeis HaBracha, in Moshe Rabbeinu's final blessing. We sing this at a chasna too. Vayehi Bishurun Melech. There is among the upright ones, Hashem is their king. V'hisasef Rashayam, when all of the heads of the people gather together. Yachad, Shiftei Yisrael, where all the tribes of Israel are Yachad. So you see from that pasuk that the name Yeshurun is given to the Jewish people only when they live in Achdus and Shalom, and not when they live in Machlokes and Sinas Chinam. That is why the Chassam Sofer says the words Shiftei Yeshurin, although they do refer to all of the Jewish people in an ideal state, belong on the stone of Binyamin, because only Binyamin exemplifies Yeshurin in its purest way. Now, why did the stone pop out? Because what was the sin of the second temple? Sinas Chinam. So when the Sinas Chinam reached whatever level it reached, we no longer merited the stone of Binyamin. We no longer merited the appellation of Yeshurin. That stone popped out. Halachically, we had to replace it. But says the Chassam Sofer, this is the makor of the Rambam, when we replaced it, we could not engrave on the stone that we are the Shiftei Yeshurin, because Hashem showed us we were not on the Madrega of Yeshurin. So we had to say, Shiftei Ka, we are the tribes of God, nevertheless. So Mamela, it's not a stira. When the Gemara in Yuma says that the stone of Binyamin had Shiftei Yeshurin, that was before it popped out in the time of Dama ben Netinah. And when the Rambam says the stone of Binyamin had Shiftei Ka, that was the response to the pop out in the time of Dama ben Netinah, when Klal Yisrael realized, when the Chachamim realized, we were not Zeicha to the appellation of Yeshua. Now, how the Rambam knew that is another question. I mean, the Rambam just made that up. You know, that you still need a makar for this. But in Svara, at least, the Chassam Sofer says that maybe they understood that once we lose the stone of Binyamin, we're no longer Zeicha to the term Yeshurin, and therefore it has to be Shiftei Ka. By the way, just another bit of yediyah about the Urim V'tumim. I described, there are many different shittas about the configurations. I described the configuration that on the first stone, the stone of Ruvain, it said Avram, Yitzchak, Yaakov, Ruvain. Every other stone had a name of a shevet. And on the last stone, it's Binyamin, Shiftei Ka, or Shiftei Yeshurin. And in other words, the Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov was on the first stone. There is, however, an alternative configuration that works this way. Every stone, except maybe the last one, had 6 letters on it. So the way it worked is the following. Stone number 1 is Reuven. Reuven has 5 letters. So there was Aleph, Avraham, Aleph for Avraham, Reuven. The next stone is Shimon, also 5 letters. So to make it 6, there's the Beis of Avraham. The third stone is Levi, which is 3 letters. So you had the 3 remaining letters of Avraham, Resh, He, Mem. You see? So that way, Avraham is spread over 3 stones, giving you 6 letters for each stone. Then you have Yehuda, which is 5 letters. So you have the Yud of Yitzchak. Okay, so in other words, instead of saying Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov were on the first stone, the alternative shita is that every stone had 6 letters. Now, if you take Binyamin, now Binyamin is already, no, Binyamin is 5 letters. Is that right? Binyamin is also 5 letters. Yeah. So, but those that had those tribes that did have 6 letters, like Yisachar, Zevulun, they did not have any extra letter there. Okay, so that's a machlokes configuration. But the shita of the Rambam is not that way. The Rambam actually learns Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov were on stone number 1. Okay. Be it as it may, back to the pasuk itself. That was a little digression. The other digression is, remember, for those of you who might unfortunately find yourself in Yale University, I hope not, remember that the motto of Yale University to this very day is the Hebrew words, Hebrew letters, Urim V'tumim. The motto of Yale University is in Hebrew, representing the light of perfect knowledge. Of course, this reminds me a little bit of a joke that the Rosh Yeshiva used to say. He said, the communist paper in the old Soviet Union was called Pravda. So Pravda means truth. So why would they call it truth? Because every single thing in the paper has to be a sheker, even the title. So if they would just call it news, or whatever, calling it truth means that's also a lie. So it's not only the newspaper that's a lie, but it's the title that's a lie too. So every single thing, it's 100% sheker. So maybe Yale too, they have to have a motto that the motto itself is a sheker, not just the education that they give. But that's because that is because in colonial times, Yale, Harvard, they go back even before there was the United States. Hebrew was a language that a well-educated person had to know. The 3 classical languages were Greek, Latin, and Hebrew. Thomas Jefferson knew Hebrew. Again, I don't know how fluent everybody was, but they had a basic knowledge of Hebrew until recently. I mean, maybe within the last 20 years, in every Harvard University graduation, there had to be a speech given by somebody in Hebrew. This goes back up to the 1600s. Some valedictory address that had to be done in Hebrew. So Yale chose the Urim V'tumim motto. Okay, but going back to the pasuk itself, I don't get this question. Now, obviously, the background of the question is simply based on the fact that, as we've gone over many, many times, when Yoshua died, there were large parts of Eretz Israel that remained to be conquered. Even though it was assigned to Shvatim, the Shevet didn't have it yet. So as a result, one of the jobs after Yoshua died is, let's finish up the conquest. And the other point is, that once land is allocated to you, you no longer get a national army, it becomes a tribal responsibility, meaning the land is given to Yehuda, you don't have all your land, it's Yehuda's job to go ahead and get it. You're not going to get a national army anymore. Okay, now given those 2 assumptions, that there's large swaths of unconquered land, and the second assumption is the responsibility for that conquest is no longer national, but tribal. So I don't get the question, who should go first? Why is there a matter of going first? Everybody should go at the same time. In other words, Bishlama, if we were talking about a national army, so we could say, let's first conquer Yehuda's chelek before we conquer other chelek. But once you're talking about a job that is going to be assigned from tribe to tribe, then what is the notion of why do you go sequentially here? Yehuda should conquer Yehuda, Yisachar should conquer Yisachar, Zevulun should conquer Zevulun. Why would Yisachar have to wait for Yehuda to conquer? And why would Zevulun have to wait for Yisachar to conquer? So what is the question, who shall go first? I would think the answer is everybody should go and conquer their own thing. right? So what exactly is the question here? So there are a few possibilities. One possibility would be that even though the primary responsibility of conquering your portion is on your tribe, it's not on the nation, but the nation could be called upon to assist, meaning to say, if Yehuda is conquering and they find themselves unable, they could call upon the nation to supply reserves. So as a result, HaKadosh Baruch Hu did not want all the tribes to be engaged in their own wars at the same time, because that would preclude them from coming to the assistance of a tribe that might be in distress. So the notion of sequencing here is simply to mean that the Jewish people will be available to assist if necessary. Now, as far as I can see in the narrative, it didn't seem the assistance was necessary. Yehuda did the job on its own. But as I say, if everybody would be fighting a different war at the same time, they would not be available to help each other. Yeah.
But it says that Yehuda asked for Shimon to come aid him in the battle, and that he would help Shimon gain his land.
Yes, yes. So that much there was a collaboration, because remember that Shimon's land is within Shevet Yehuda. But what I'm saying is, just as Yehuda turned to Shimon, which he did, theoretically, if that wouldn't have been enough, they could have turned to other tribes, and therefore HaKadosh Baruch Hu did not want all the tribes to be doing their own thing at the same time. They should remain like Miluim, they should remain like reservists, who could be called duty. So that would be the explanation of the question. Nevertheless, the answer is Yehuda goes first, and you'll remember from the book of Yoshua that Shevet Shimon did not actually have a separate portion in the land. They had cities that were interspersed with Yehuda's territory. It's almost as if Hashem wanted to keep them apart, not to create a nuclear reaction of anger or whatever it would be. And as a result, it is recorded that Shimon assisted Yehuda in completing the conquest. Yeah.
I believe that there's still a concern of driving out the Canaanites through theft, it's all from the Chumash. That Hashem doesn't want to drive out the Canaanites too fast, lest wild animals come in and devour us.
It is a very good question. The Torah itself tells us you will not conquer the land right away, lest you get rid of the people and you don't have a large enough population to fill up the land, and the animals will multiply and make things very dangerous for you. Now, it's very, very clear that that's why the period of Yehoshua's conquest took 7 years. So I think that's very clear. Hashem could have made the conquest happen in a day. It's stretched out. The question is, does that continue to be a relevant concern? Remember, after at least 14 years, maybe 28 years. Remember, we have a machlokas how long Yeshua's reign is. It's either 14 years or it might be up to 28 years. And I think we'll see, we didn't get to it today, but I think we'll see as we go through the psukim that that does not seem to be the reason at this point, simply because other reasons are given. In other words, it'll actually say why we were not zocher to conquer all the land by this time. But I think you are correct. The initial idea of why the kibush took 7 years is Vadai connected to that. Yeah.
Rabbi, considering that machlokas, it's not like we're talking about a year or two margin in error. Like 14 years versus 28 years that's a real chunk of time. How is it that we don't have a more active understanding of how long these are?
Yeah, well, you're right. Obviously, this has a lot of repercussions in terms of calculating the period of the judges and the like. But there are, occasionally, not that often, but occasionally we do have some major chronological gaps, because the problem basically is like this. The only years of Yehoshua that are recorded are the 7 years of conquest and the 7 years of division. So we only have 14 years that are mentioned. We are told, however, that Yehoshua died at 110. Now, given the fact that we had left Mitzrayim, if you just go into 14 years, only 14 years earlier than that. So that would put Yehoshua at the time of entering the land, 110 minus 14, which is how much? 96. And that would mean at the time of the spies, which is 40 years earlier, he would have been 56. Kalev, on the other hand, we know Beferish was 40. And Chazal seem to favor the assumption that Yoshua and Kalev were approximately the same age. And hence they add an extra 14 years. It's kind of making Yoshua and Kalev close to the same age. That still means Yoshua was 42 and Kalev was 40, but that makes them much closer. But you're correct, there's a lot of confusion in this area. Okay, we'll stop here.
Thank you for listening to this Ohr Somayach production. To find out more and to partner in our mission, please visit ohr.edu.